U.S. Capitol explodes in tension as Jasmine Crockett faces off against Barron Trump under blinding lights with over 20 million Americans watching live. Pride, legacy, and bloodlines collide in a battle that feels less like a hearing and more like a war for truth itself. One chart, one envelope, and one unanswered question could shatter a dynasty forever. So what secret hidden in those numbers will bring America to its knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The United States Congress, burned under white lights, transformed into a stage where history was about to snap. The banner above read, "Truth in Political Families," but no one was fooled. This wasn't a polite discussion. It was an ambush aimed directly at the Trump dynasty. Tens of millions of Americans leaned closer to their screens, the silence so sharp it cut through living rooms across the nation. The cameras swept the chamber like predators. They froze on Barron Trump, his posture steel, his gaze unflinching, the picture of a young heir who believed nothing could touch him. Then the lens shifted. Jasmine Crockett sat opposite, her eyes locked forward, fierce, unyielding. On her desk lay a single red envelope, thick and dangerous, a live explosive disguised as paper. The official theme was transparency. The hidden truth was succession. Barron insisted he was the rightful heir. Jasmine held a weapon, far deadlier DNA that could shatter bloodlines in a single stroke. The chair's voice cut the air. Congress will now hear the evidence from Representative Jasmine Crockett. The spotlight crashed onto her. The nation stopped breathing. The chamber was silent, the weight of anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Then came the sound, soft, deliberate, the tearing of paper, as Jasmine Crockett slowly opened the red envelope. Every camera in the room tilted toward her, every pair of eyes locked on her hands as if they held a detonator. She drew out a thick folder, crisp and unyielding, and unfolded a massive DNA chart that stretched across the table like a battlefield map. The room tensed as she slid it into the light, her voice calm but razor sharp. Barron leaned back in his chair, lips curled in a smirk that dripped with disdain. "This is nothing more than cheap theater," he scoffed, the arrogance in his tone echoing against the marble walls. For a moment his confidence seemed unshakable, the kind of smirk born from a lifetime of untouchable privilege. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood, one hand pressing the chart flat, the other pointing to the colored markers that traced lines between names and bloodlines. The tension in the room turned suffocating. 3 samples, Jasmine said evenly, her words cutting through the static air. Donald Trump, Barron Trump, and Melania Trump. The science does not lie. She let the silence linger before striking with precision. There is no maternal connection between Melania Trump and Barron Trump. The result is absolute. 0%. Each syllable hit like a hammer, cold and deliberate. For a split second, time seemed frozen. Then the chamber erupted. Gasps filled the air, overlapping with frantic whispers that tore through the silence like wildfire. The press gallery lit up in a frenzy, cameras flashing in a staccato of white bursts. Senators clutched their desks, some standing in shock, others shouting over each other for clarity. A wave of voices surged, questions, denials, demands, all colliding in a storm of disbelief. The walls of Congress had not shaken like this in decades. Barron shot up, his smirk gone, his voice cracking into rage. "Fake lab Photoshop. This is a setup." His fist slammed against the desk, the sound booming like a gunshot. The fury in his eyes tried to smother the rising tide of doubt, but the tremor in his voice betrayed the fear underneath. Jasmine didn't look at him. Her focus never wavered. With a flick of her wrist, she lifted another sheet of paper. "This is an email," Jasmine declared, her tone unyielding. "From an independent laboratory, time-stamped, digitally verified, signed by Dr. Robert Haynes, a leading geneticist. It confirms the result not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. 0% match between Melania Trump and Barron Trump." She held it high, the camera zooming in, the signature glinting under the lights. The paper itself became a weapon, irrefutable, undeniable. The feed cut to Melania Trump, seated stiffly in the second row. Her face was pale, drained of its usual composure, her jaw locked as though holding back an earthquake. Her hands trembled ever so slightly on her lap, a movement the cameras caught and broadcast live to millions. She blinked rapidly, fighting to keep her mask of elegance intact, but the truth was already clawing at the surface. The nation could see it, the crack in the facade. Chaos swept the chamber. On one side, Jasmine's allies pounded their desks, voices raised in furious agreement. Show the truth, let the evidence stand. On the other, Trump loyalists erupted in protest, their shouts clashing like steel against steel, lies witch hunt fabrication. The chairman's gavel slammed again and again, but it was drowned in the roar. The walls shook with the force of two Americas colliding, truth and denial, locked in combat. Through it all, Jasmine remained calm, her voice slicing through the storm like a blade. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Barron, her tone steady, ice cold. "This is not a show," she said, her words carrying above the chaos. "This is not a game. This is evidence." Each word rang heavy, undeniable, as if carved into stone. For a moment the shouting faltered, the fury ebbed, and the chamber was forced to listen. Barron's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, his earlier arrogance shattered. The camera zoomed closer, capturing the storm on his face. The desperation, the fury, the dread clawing at him. Melania's gaze stayed fixed on the floor, refusing to meet her son's eyes. The entire chamber pulsed with unease, caught between disbelief and the hard truth screaming from the charts in front of them. And in that silence, Jasmine let the last line drop, a hammer blow, to end the chaos. "This is not a performance. This is proof." The chamber froze. The world watched, and the story had only just begun. The last line still hung in the air like smoke when Barron rose. He straightened his jacket, let a small, scornful smile bloom, and faced the bench. He said, "DNA cannot decide a family. I am my mother's son, no matter what the results say." His voice was cool and defiant, engineered to cut through the cameras and into living rooms. The gallery murmured. The lights poured heat. The chart lay between them like a live wire. Jasmine remained still, both hands flat on the table, watching him like a surgeon watches a monitor. He pivoted to memory the way a seasoned witness pivots to a script. He spoke of lullabies and late-night fevers of private school recitals and the steady hand that smoothed his hair. He painted a portrait of devotion, a son carried through sickness, a mother waiting by hospital doors, a home that never let go. He turned from the chart and gestured to Melania, as if the bond itself could rise and speak for him. A hum of sympathy rippled across the conservative benches, the low percussion of nods. And that's right. For a breathless minute, the past tried to eclipse the printouts. Then the loyalists rose like a tide, their voices hard with certainty, their applause a shield hammered from party brass. "Stand tall," Barron one called. "Do not let them smear your mother," another barked, and the chant rolled, "Let him speak." He reached into his folder, unfolded a crisp page, and lifted his chin for the microphones. He read in a measured cadence, each line crafted for the evening news. "I am the target of a political witch hunt." He spoke of vendettas of enemies who feared his future, of a machine built to destroy his name before he could claim it. The cameras drank it in like neon, but the chart on the table did not blink. Jasmine waited for the page to settle and for the echoes to fade. She did not match his volume. She let precision do the work. She said, "We are not here to debate feelings. We are here to examine the truth." Her hand returned to the graph tracing markers, allele counts, the blunt arithmetic that refused to rearrange itself for anyone. She explained again slowly the same conclusion, printed 3 times by 3 separate tests, the silence deepening with each word. No insult, no slogan. No slogan, again only the data humming like a live current under the fluorescent glare. The last thread of restraint snapped. Barron slammed his palm onto the wood, the crack ricocheting off the walls and drawing a ripple of shock from the press row. He leaned over the microphone, eyes, burning jaw set like iron, and repeated his defiance in a hoarse, rising growl. Across the aisle, Melania held her posture as if braced against wind, but her eyes shimmered glassy with the strain of holding everything together. She blinked twice and fixed her gaze on the table's edge, refusing to meet the chart, the cameras, or her son. The room's temperature seemed to climb, a furnace of shouts from one side and applause from the other, a storm without a ceiling. He had thrown sentiment, lineage, loyalty, and volume at the wall, and for a few hot minutes it almost felt like enough. But the chart did not flinch, the signatures did not blur, and the independent timestamp did not wobble under pressure. Jasmine's poise absorbed the chaos the way bedrock absorbs waves, and the case sat there intact, a weight no oratory could lift. Conservative allies gave Barron their chorus committee rules, gave him the microphone, and family imagery gave him cover, but none of it pierced the data. The evidence remained on the table, measurable, repeatable, stubborn as gravity, and everyone in the chamber knew it. From proof to pushback, the fight had shifted, but the foundation had not moved an inch. The chairman's gavel hovered, then eased back down. Breath returned to the room in uneven waves. Barron stood rigid jaw, tight papers, clenched white. Jasmine waited, eyes steady, hands still on evidence. Nothing he'd said had touched the numbers. They remained unshaken as ink under glass. But the stillness broke the moment Jasmine lifted her hand toward the screen. On the wall-sized display, the DNA diagram glowed 3 circles labeled Donald, Barron, and Melania. Lines connected father to son in clean arithmetic, but one node stood apart. The circle marked mother was a stark red ring, empty at its center, pulsing like an alarm. Jasmine pointed to it with a steady finger that did not tremble. The cameras tightened their frame, catching the glare off the colored bands, and breath collecting at every throat. This seat cannot be filled by Melania. It belongs to someone else. Jasmine said each word paced and planed, the syllables cutting as if edged. The effect moved through the chamber like a vacuum. Air seemed to drain from the room. Chairs creaked and then went dead still, as if anything louder would break a fragile membrane. Even the gavel hesitated midair, arrested by the sentence. Someone coughed and swallowed the sound as though it might count as dissent. Silence. "Stop, you're humiliating my family," Barron shouted, lurching forward as if the podium itself had jerked him. His voice cracked at the top, and then hardened anger wrapping around humiliation like a cast. He spread his arms toward the screen as though his reach could erase the red ring. His shoulders heaved, his jaw quivered. The microphones hissed with the overload. A ripple of sympathetic clucks rose from his side of the aisle, muffled and urgent. "Then who is Barron's biological mother?" A lawmaker from the opposition barked, the question ricocheting off marble like a thrown coin. It bounced between desks and notebooks, gathering weight as it went. Heads pivoted toward Jasmine. Pens hovered above pages. Every camera red light brightened. The silence around the question made it louder. A drumbeat measured in heartbeats. Even the chart seemed to lean into the moment, daring an answer. Jasmine did not oblige the demand with a name. Instead, she reached for a clear sleeve from her stack and lifted a USCIS document into the floodlights. The seal caught and flashed. The page itself was clinical, the language of entry status and dates. A European national, she said evenly, who entered the United States in 2005. She let the year hang there, aligned with a private calendar everyone in the room already knew. The implication landed hard, louder than any shouted accusation yet. She stepped closer to the projector and held the document beside the glowing circles. The juxtaposition framed a timeline without saying it: an arrival date, a gestational arc, a birth recorded months later. No embellishment, no narrative, just coordinates that mapped onto the red ring like a pin on glass. She did not label the pattern. She did not have to. 3 rows of reporters scribbled it themselves. Everyone could do the math. The chamber convulsed. Members sprang to their feet in a scrambled chorus of demands and denials and procedural objections. Out of order, produce the source. Let the witness finish. The chairman hammered the gavel wood on wood, while the press gallery hissed with camera shutters and whispered confirmations. Aides darted between seats, passing notes, trading phones, eyes wild with calculation. The air shook like a subway rushing through a tunnel. Through the roar, Jasmine stayed planted, one palm on the table, the other on the document sleeve. Her eyes did not leave the screen. The red ring was still pulsing, there a vacancy no applause could fill. Barron's color drained until it matched the marble, the rage cooling into a chalky fear. He stared at the screen as if it might blink and rewrite itself out of mercy. Behind him, Melania shifted rows half an inch and turned as though to leave, only to freeze. A camera unit swung on its track and cut her off the lens, a black, unblinking eye. The spotlight pinned her like a specimen, bleaching every angle into stark relief. She steadied her bag with one hand and lifted her chin with the other, the choreography of someone refusing to flee before the first step. Around her, the chamber held its collective breath, waiting for motion or collapse. The red ring on the screen kept beating empty and undeniable. From the red ring to the man beneath it, the focus snapped to Barron as the chamber bristled. The heat from the last exchange still pulsed as he rose, steadying himself with one palm on the table. Even if it is true, I am still a lawful son under the law, he said, the tremor barely masked by practiced poise. The microphones caught it and sent a fine crack across the marble and through a million living rooms. He squared his shoulders, jaw-locked eyes forward, refusing to yield the frame or the story. Behind him, the chart glowed like a verdict that would not look away, cold colors and unforgiving geometry unyielding. He leaned on language and statutes as if they were scaffolding in a storm. He spoke of certificates, signatures, and the stability legal recognition provides in a nation built on paper and oath. He repeated that identity under law anchors public life when tempests try to tear it loose. Even if it is true I am still a lawful son under the law, he said firmer, giving the line a cadence for the evening news. He tried to drag the fight from biology to bureaucracy, from blood to filings, from the bright screen to the comfort of ink. His gaze slid past the red ring and settled on the committee seal as if it could grant protection. Republican members surged into the opening he created, rising from 2 rows back, with voices tuned for televised combat and clipped outrage. This is an attack on the honor of a former president's family, one declared, jabbing the air for emphasis under the lights. This committee is being used to humiliate a private mother and a son, another shouted, urging the chair to censure Jasmine immediately. A third demanded the materials be struck until counsel could review every page and chain of custody in painstaking detail. The gallery split into dueling noise, applause, boos, and the metallic chatter of cameras spitting light in relentless bursts. Aides hustled the aisles, passing notes and phones like tourniquets, while the floor shook with partisan contention. Jasmine did not lift her voice. She lifted the standard and the burden of proof itself. The law cannot be built on biological falsehood, she said, flat and clean. A plumb line dropped through the noise and into the transcript. One hand rested on the chart, the other on the independently verified email anchors holding the evidence against heat and theater. Her phrasing was ordinary by design, words anyone at home could repeat without stumbling or needing counsel to explain. She reminded the room that process is not theater. It is measurement, replication, and courage to enter results into the public record. The sentence hung there simple and immovable, while shouts broke around it like surf and then fell back exhausted. Anger rippled over Barron's face, bright and fast, then drained away, leaving a colder worry. His fingers began to tap once, twice, then trembled a Morse code his suit could not hide. His eyes slid off the chart, skirted Jasmine, and fixed on a neutral grain in the wood, as if emptiness offered the safest harbor. The defiance at his jaw softened into worry, the set of his mouth loosening as uncertainty took root. He adjusted a cuffling, missed, tried again, and missed once more, a tiny loop that said more than any speech. He swallowed and blinked as if resetting the frame might reset the facts. He reached into his folder for a final line that could alchemize zero into lineage, but paper offered nothing back. Even if it is true, I am still a lawful son under the law, he said a third time. And now the echo sounded thin, the lifeline frayed. Across the aisle, one loyalist demanded an apology to the former First Lady, while another called for order as if volume could restore it. Jasmine stayed centered, letting the numbers speak each time rhetoric tried to take their place and blur the chart. The gavel hovered, then settled, marking only that time was passing and the record was holding. This was the counterweight moment, taut and suspended, just before the hinge turns to the decisive detail. From the taut standoff, Jasmine moved from argument to proof, her posture steady as she slid a new document into the light. She opened a secure folder and mirrored it to the main screen, revealing an internal lab email with clean headers, a verified domain, and a visible digital signature stamp. This internal communication certifies that Melania Trump's blood sample does not match Barron Trump, she said, keeping her voice, even the phrasing, simple enough for anyone at home. The timestamp glowed in the corner, down to seconds, paired with chain of custody notes that read like a flight plan no one could rewrite midair. She highlighted the concluding line, non-match on maternally inherited markers, across the board. The room seemed to tighten around the pixels as though the message were a physical weight. She clicked once more and a video tile opened beside the email, the frame settling on a lab office and a man in a white coat. This file includes the sworn statement of the supervising scientist. Jasmine said, letting the title card roll, PhD Director of Testing, Independent Laboratory. He looked into the lens and spoke clearly without flourish or hesitation. We ran the test 3 times. The results were the same. Melania cannot be the biological mother. The words landed with a dull, heavy finality, more like a stamp than a sentence. The clip displayed its own timestamp and verification, hashed neat as a seal pressed into wax. Jasmine paused the frame with the declaration frozen mid-caption, letting the silence register the meaning. Congress reeled in a hush that sounded louder than shouting. A camera cut hard to Barron's face. His eyes were wet at the rims, his jaw tight enough to tremble. He breathed through his nose, a small, uneven pull, and blinked fast once, twice, like a swimmer refusing to swallow water. The gavel did not fall. Even the chair seemed to know that any interruption would sound like denial. In the press gallery, pens scratched, then stopped, then scratched again, as if writers were relearning their hands. Someone in the back exhaled too loudly and drew a dozen stares quick and sharp. Jasmine did not fill the quiet with her own voice. She filled it with the next piece of evidence. A nurse at a European hospital also confirmed there was another patient in the 2006 birth, she said, and lifted a second document sleeve into the lights. The page carried a hospital letterhead and a date that matched the year on every timeline already discussed. Attached was a short attestation referencing a parallel mother under care. She did not read names. She did not need to. The assertion was the point, and the point was plain. She let the clerk circulate copies to both sides, the rustle of paper, a small, relentless drum. On the screen, the red ring marked mother seemed to pulse harder, as if hearing its own name called. The committee sat stunned under the fluorescent wash, the law, and the story suddenly forced into the same narrow lane. Barron's fingers quivered over the edge of his folder, then stilled, then quivered again, a tiny metronome of panic he could not hide. His eyes slid off the documents and tried to find neutral ground in the grain of the desk, but neutral ground had vanished. Some on his side opened their mouths and closed them again, discovering that there was nothing useful to say against time-stamped signatures and a clear sentence recorded on video. Jasmine remained centered, one hand on the email printout, one on the nurse's statement, the 2 pages, like bookends that would not budge. This was the hinge, the moment when neither law nor sentiment could push back the door. With the lab's verdict and the nurse's attestation frozen on the screen, the chamber hovered on a single breath. Barron lowered his head as if the weight had finally chosen a place to land. His shoulders collapsed inward, the frame of a fighter suddenly unsure where the next punch would come from. He gripped the edge of the desk knuckles, blanching, the bravado drained to a dull ache. A small shiver traveled through his back and settled in his hands, a tremor he could not will away. The red ring on the projection pulsed in his peripheral vision like a beacon that would not dim. Jasmine did not advance to claim the moment. She refused triumph like a trap. She met the cameras with the quiet a surgeon brings to a beating heart. Her voice came low, warm, and measured. Truth can hurt, but it needs to be spoken. She did not add a threat or a victory lap. She let the sentence do the work cleanly. The line occupied the air like a bar of iron, cooling bright at the edges, strong at the core. Across the dais, pens hesitated above paper, reluctant to move before the weight of the words settled. Melania's composure finally cracked along an invisible seam. Tears gathered, swelled, and spilled without sound, catching the white lights and splitting into glassy flecks. She pressed her lips together, refusing to speak, refusing to plead, as if words themselves might be held against her. The cameras tightened, then tightened again, but no protest came, only breath, hitching in a rhythm she could not smooth. A hand rose halfway to her face and paused as though permission were required to touch her own grief. Still, she said nothing, granting the moment a silence that sounded louder than any defense. Barron's voice returned as a thin whisper wandering between registers. He kept his eyes on the wood grain and asked almost to the desk. Then, who am I? The question bounced once and seemed to lose its footing, then rolled outward until it filled the chamber. Senators stopped writing. Photographers stopped clicking. The gavel fell still as if order had fled the room. The phrase traveled around the chart, the seal, and the lights searching for a wall to rest on, and finding none. What remained was a boy inside a suit waiting for an answer he had not rehearsed. Jasmine answered without moving closer, as if the distance itself were a kindness. You are not defined by your parents' lies. You are defined by how you face the truth today. The words landed like a hand extended firm, but not pulling steady without pity. She let the two sentences stand shoulder to shoulder, neither accusing nor excusing, just pointing to a door only he could open. A hush settled that felt less like fear and more like a boundary finally drawn. For a long beat, nothing tried to compete with that exchange. The air held still, bent by the gravity of a simple choice made under merciless lights. Then from the mid-row benches, a few lawmakers began to clap, uncertain at first, then steady, a rhythm that did not aim to humiliate but to acknowledge. Others stayed motionless, hands locked, faces hard with the effort of pretending the evidence could be ignored. The chair watched and did not lift the gavel, as if even procedure understood it should step aside. This was a direct ending. The antagonist was undone not only by proof, but by the moral choice pressed into his open hands. The sound spread in cautious waves, rolling forward and breaking against rows that refused to move. Cameras found Barron. His head remained bowed, breath shallow, hands folded as if to keep from shaking. Melania stayed, rigid eyes, wet lips pressed shut, a portrait of silence that said more than any rebuttal. Jasmine did not smile or frown. She stood in the same posture she had held all afternoon, the posture of someone who had chosen evidence over triumph. In that applause, the room delivered a verdict without a vote, and the contest that began in noise ended in a choice no statute could make for him. The chamber did not recover. The gavel struck 3 times, but order could not be restored. Finally, the chair announced a recess, and the hearing dissolved into a storm. Lawmakers left in knots of shouting, staffers scurried with files, and the cameras kept rolling even as the lights dimmed. Outside, the air split open. Within minutes, every major network splashed the same headline across screens and tickers: DNA shocker. It was bold, it was final, and it spread like fire across America's living rooms. By nightfall, the country was no longer watching a hearing. It was watching history rip itself open. Every cable channel ran loops of the same footage: Jasmine holding the chart, Barron's trembling face, Melania's silent tears. Analysts filled the airwaves, dissecting every pause and every word, replaying the clip frame by frame like it was the Zapruder film. One anchor declared, "This is not just politics, this is bloodline." Another warned, "We've crossed into territory no dynasty survives." The screens glowed through midnight, then into dawn. Social media burned hotter. Hashtags fought each other for dominance: DNA exposed, stand with Barron, Trump lies. On one side, sympathy poured for Barron, the young man suddenly stripped bare before a nation, a pawn in games older than him. On the other, outrage rose at the Trump family, accused of constructing a lie and parading it as legacy. Comment threads became battlefields. Old allies, unfollowed families argued across kitchen tables and newsrooms, begged for more angles to feed the hunger. In town halls and diners and subway cars and church basements, the debate turned personal. Some fathers leaned over coffee cups and whispered, "Blood doesn't make a parent." Mothers shook their heads and replied, "But you don't lie to a country like that." Ordinary people saw their own lives reflected in extraordinary scandal, and that reflection made the story unstoppable. Sympathy was real, fury was real, and neither side would retreat. Through the noise, one figure emerged above the flood. Jasmine Crockett's face played on every screen, still unwavering, caught in that moment when she said, "Truth can hurt, but it needs to be spoken." Overnight, she was no longer just a congresswoman from Texas. She was the emblem of evidence against dynasty, a banner for those who believed power had finally met its match. Editorials framed her as a modern Cassandra who refused silence, or as Joan of Arc standing against the machine. The phrase most repeated was the one she left the hearing with: "No one stands above the truth." And so the lesson crystallized not in footnotes or legal briefs, but in the raw pulse of public opinion. Family, people argued, is not just blood. It is love, it is loyalty, it is memory. But when blood is faked, when truth is buried for the sake of political inheritance, the entire edifice collapses. Dynasties that cheat their own roots will rot from within. The Trump mythos, once sold as gold, was now on trial in the court of the American conscience. The hearing had been paused, but America had not. Outside the Capitol, protesters gathered with homemade signs: Truth, Power, DNA, Destiny. Families can heal, but lies can't. Inside, senators huddled in shadowed rooms, already calculating what alliances would crumble and what careers could end. The shock had not settled, it was still spreading, still rewiring the political map in real time. And in the middle of it all, Jasmine remained calm, a figure cut from the clarity of the evidence she carried. She had not shouted, she had not mocked, she had not broken her rhythm. She had only placed the truth on the table, and the nation had done the rest. She became the unavoidable headline, the unavoidable conversation, the unavoidable mirror. By the end of the week, the story had outgrown one chamber, one family, one name. It was about the single line that no dynasty, no fortune, no lie could ever cross again. Truth will always surface. The recess did not cool the fire, it only gave it air. In the first hour back, the chamber erupted into competing speeches about transparency in political families, each side framing the phrase like a weapon. One senator pounded the dais and declared that a republic cannot function if lineage is staged like theater. Another shouted that privacy and dignity must stand above voyeurism even when the cameras demand blood. Motions flew to compel more records, to expand the scope, to create a bipartisan council with subpoena power. The gavel rode the storm, but the word transparency kept returning, like a drumbeat no one could silence. Across the aisle, the arguments split along lines that looked ideological but felt existential. If a dynasty can falsify the most basic fact of origin, what else can it falsify? A reformer demanded, voice low and lethal. A defender snapped back: "We are not criminalizing motherhood because a chart has no mercy." A veteran lawmaker tried to triangulate and failed, mumbling about process while the room raced past him. Draft language for an ethics package flashed on monitors proposing sworn disclosures of parentage for candidates in immediate family. The floor buzzed as staffers traded white papers like emergency rations in a siege. Committees scheduled midnight sessions as if daylight made truth slippery. The judiciary crowd workshopped a family disclosure clause, arguing that sworn statements were already commonplace for finances, so origins should not be taboo. Oversight hawks proposed chain of custody rules for any future testing, turning laboratory terms into legislative text. Civil libertarians warned that privacy is not a toy to break when politics gets bored. The chair reminded everyone that the public was watching and that credibility was bleeding out on live television. No one disagreed that whatever passed would redraw lines Americans had assumed were permanent. Outside the building, the story stopped being a story and became a symbol. In diners, barbershops, and factory break rooms, people said the same phrase with different tones: "I don't believe them anymore." The collapse of trust did not arrive as a crash. It came like a slow fracture that suddenly reached the surface. The Trump name, once marketed as indestructible, found itself measured against a red ring on a screen and a sentence that would not retract. Some supporters doubled down, insisting narrative could outshout numbers, but donors and operatives read the wind with colder eyes. The dynasty felt less like a tower and more like scaffolding creaking under its own branding. Deep analysis poured out of think tanks that had not been relevant in years. They charted how Americans process legacy as myth first, as record second, and as truth only when forced. They showed that dynasties endure on stories that blur the edges between private and public until the blur itself becomes the brand. The event cut through that blur like a wire, teaching viewers to ask for documentation where they had once accepted aura. The language shifted too. People started saying verify instead of assume, and disclose instead of trust. In a country that loves legend, the appetite for receipts suddenly outpaced the appetite for romance. Cable panels did not simply debate policy, they dramatized a national re-education in real time. One anchor held up a birth certificate next to a campaign poster and asked which one should count more. A conservative commentator warned that families are made of love, and that love is not a lab report. A civil rights lawyer replied that love forgives, but it does not launder a lie for power. A historian noted that American dynasties never fall from one scandal. They fall when a scandal rewrites the vocabulary people use to judge them. By sunrise, the phrase transparency in political families had moved from slogan to standard. The chain reaction did not stop at politics. It ran through living rooms and school cafeterias. Teenagers stitched the hearing into short videos and added their own captions. We deserve the right to know our origins. In group chats, kids of adoption, IVF, and surrogacy shared vulnerable notes about truth, love, and paperwork. Many said they felt seen for the first time, not because the cameras were kind, but because honesty finally had a microphone. Guidance counselors reported a spike in students asking for conversations about family records, medical histories, and identity. The story had turned into a civics lesson no textbook had dared to print. Universities convened emergency forums that looked more like sold-out concerts. Bioethicists debated jurists on whether parentage disclosures should be normalized or narrowly cabined. Genetic counselors explained how tests work and how they fail, resisting the rush to treat science like magic. Student leaders quoted Jasmine's line, "No one stands above the truth," and asked why that had ever been controversial. Campus papers ran editorials insisting that dignity and disclosure can coexist if the intent is care, not spectacle. It was messy, brave, and louder than any lecture on constitutional theory. Religious communities answered with their own reckonings. Pastors preached that truth and mercy must arrive together, or both are counterfeit. Rabbis said that genealogy in Scripture matters, but repentance matters more. Imams spoke of trust as a sacred deposit that rulers must not squander. The pews filled with quiet, complicated nods, the kind that mark growth rather than victory. What started as a political scandal had become a moral conversation people were no longer afraid to have. In boardrooms, brand managers stared at crisis decks and found themselves out of vocabulary. Foundations tied to famous names delayed galas, worried that donor lists had turned into landmines. Corporate recruiters began asking fewer questions about networks and more questions about disclosures, a polite pivot that said everything. Publicists workshopped new lines that tried to separate charity from lineage, service from surname. The old promise borrowed prestige. Instant trust had been downgraded by a three-word proof, show the record. Courthouses braced for a wave and got it. Family courts received motions, citing the hearing as precedent for openness, even when names were redacted and facts were private. Judges wrote opinions that threaded needles affirming privacy, while warning that lies told for political gain infect public trust. Legal clinics taught chain of custody to clients who had never heard the term before Tuesday. Prosecutors quietly updated guidance on affidavit fraud, no longer treating it as a paperwork issue when power was the prize. The system realized that small deceptions had large shadows when cast across national ambition. Campaigns learned the lesson with the speed that fear provides. New candidates released parentage affidavits, unprompted, tucked beside tax returns, like a form of emotional transparency. Press releases sounded almost humble, promising proactive clarity and respect for the public's right to know. Opponents who mocked the move as performative watched polls bump anyway, as voters rewarded the gesture even when it felt awkward. Strategists coined a phrase, origin audit, and pretended they had always believed in it. What looked like a fad began to calcify into a norm. Meanwhile, ordinary families opened drawers and boxes and finally talked. It was not all tidy or kind. Some truths landed hard and cracked the floorboards before they healed. But more often than not, conversations ended with arms around shoulders and a new definition of we that could hold both history and hope. Therapists said that the headline had given cover to courage and courage had done the rest. A country trained to avoid hard questions had asked one together and survived the answer. The shock had turned into structure. By week's end, the debate inside Congress echoed the debate outside privacy as a shield versus privacy as a mask. Reformers insisted that when power is on the line, the mask must come off. Skeptics warned that public hunger can become cruelty if not disciplined by ethics. The emerging consensus, fragile and real, was this: love defines a family, but lies cannot define a republic. In that balance, transparency in political families stopped sounding radical and started sounding like maintenance. The chain reaction had finished its first loop and returned to the place it began, what the public can believe when the lights turn on. 1 year later, the hearing was no longer just a memory, it had become text printed in ink and bound inside history books. High school civics courses quoted the exchange verbatim, while university syllabi highlighted it in bold under the heading, Truth versus Power. Professors dissected Jasmine's calm against Barron's collapse, drawing circles on whiteboards that mirrored the DNA chart once burned into the nation's eyes. Students leaned forward, some stunned that politics could look so raw, others scribbling notes as if truth itself were now examinable. The moment had transformed from breaking news to case study, its weight surviving the churn of news cycles. At Harvard, Georgetown, and Berkeley, mock trials replicated the hearing. One side defended dynasty, the other defended disclosure. And every semester ended the same way: the students demanded transparency. Law schools debated whether genetic truth should be codified in candidate disclosures, a conversation unthinkable, before the red ring glowed on the Capitol screen. Political science seminars used Jasmine's quote, "No one stands above the truth," as the cornerstone of lectures on accountability. In ethics departments, the phrase truth versus power became shorthand for a new kind of civic expectation: evidence before loyalty. The world did not look away. In London, newspapers ran editorials titled "The Trump Precedent," asking what other dynasties might hide. In Paris, a talk show opened with the blunt question, if America cannot trust its first families, who can? In Tokyo, political commentators drew parallels to their own hereditary politics, warning that transparency was no longer optional in an age of DNA and digital records. Across Africa and South America, op-eds praised Jasmine's defiance as proof that even in the heart of empire, truth could still rise against legacy. The scandal became not just American, it became global currency in conversations about the morality of power. At the United Nations, delegates invoked the case during debates on leadership ethics. One ambassador remarked, "What happened in Washington was not a family scandal. It was a mirror held up to every government that hides its lineage of lies." The remark drew applause rare in that chamber. NGOs folded the story into campaigns for accountability, pairing Jasmine's face with slogans demanding openness in politics. International conferences featured panels titled "Bloodlines and Lies: The Price of Dynasties." Everywhere the scandal traveled, it forced elites to answer a simple, brutal question: what is your truth worth? Jasmine Crockett herself stood transformed. She had not sought to become a symbol, but the symbol claimed her anyway. Profiles described the pressure she faced: death threats, smear campaigns, endless commentary on her career's survival. Yet the story had inverted those attacks. She was remembered not as a disruptor, but as the woman who unlocked the truth when no one else dared. Magazine covers framed her as steel and red, the envelope still in her hand, eyes locked forward. Commentators noted that while others shouted, she had whispered, and the whisper carried further. Behind the scenes, colleagues admitted the cost she bore. Allies recalled how she received anonymous warnings, how donors pulled support, how committees tried to box her out. Yet she refused to step back. Courage, one historian wrote, is not noise. It is persistence in the silence after noise has ended. That line joined the textbooks, too, paired with her name. And as the months passed, she was no longer just a politician. She was an emblem of a question America had avoided for too long: can truth survive power? In the end, the answer was carved not in theory, but in practice. The hearing, the chart, the red ring they lived on, as evidence that truth, as though bruised, can pierce dynasties. A year later, when the nation looked back, it did not remember just the chaos or the shouting. It remembered Jasmine standing against the storm and saying words simple enough for a child to repeat: "No one stands above the truth." From textbooks and tribunals, the lens swung toward the young who had to live with what remained. In dorm lounges and phone-lit bedrooms, the viral clip gave way to a quieter, heavier conversation: what it means to belong without a script. Barron, once armored in certainty, now stood as a silhouette against the glare, a figure people whispered about, not with scorn, but with an ache they recognized. He had been raised inside a theater of image, then dropped into a courtroom of proof, a fall every kid could imagine, in smaller ways. The question he had asked then, "Who am I?" kept echoing long after the lights and headlines moved on. He did not hold rallies or publish a memoir. The symbol built itself without his consent. Teachers used his televised unraveling to ask their classes simple, impossible questions. Where does identity come from? What survives when a story breaks? Teenagers clipped the hearing into 6-second beats, then added captions that hurt to read. Learn the truth, or the truth will learn you. Parents who once preached legacy began practicing transparency, opening old folders and older wounds. It was messy, embarrassing, and for the first time in a long time, honest. Counselors said the line outside their doors formed earlier each morning. Kids spoke about secrets that had curdled at the edges of family pictures, the missing birth father, the unspoken adoption, the donor number tucked in a drawer. They said they felt less alone because the biggest story in the country had admitted that pretending is fragile, and reality always collects its debt. One boy whispered, "I was raised to be a brand," and everyone knew he did not mean politics. Another girl said, "I want records, not rumors," and the room nodded like a single person. The symbol was not sainthood, it was permission. The culture bent around this permission like metal heated in a forge. Documentaries appeared with titles that made producers nervous a year ago. Origins Receipts Unmasked. Podcasts ran mini-series on truth hygiene, teaching listeners how to separate a family's sacred privacy from a dynasty's public performance. Librarians curated shelves that paired DNA primers with memoirs of found families, the science beside the soul. In film schools, students storyboarded a central image, a red ring on a screen, empty and honest, refusing to be filled by wish or decree. The class consensus was simple story is powerful, but proof is mortal. Barron, wherever he was, felt the heat of being used as a lesson and the chill of needing one. Reporters chased him less. Teenagers chased his shadow more because the shadow was theirs. The symbol became neither a hero nor a villain, but a mirror for everything young people fear about inheritance. What if the script is a lie and the movie refuses to end? They did not ask him for speeches. They asked themselves for courage. Live with the truth, a coach wrote on a locker room whiteboard, or the truth will live without you. The team won that night and cried anyway. Church basements hosted evening circles that did not try to fix anyone. People read the transcript aloud, just the questions, just the answers, and let silence do the heavy lifting. A grandmother said, "Love raises a child, lies raise a stranger." A foster dad said, "I am not afraid of DNA. I am afraid of the absence of love." A teen held up a sticky note that read, "No one stands above the truth," and everyone agreed it was both a comfort and a dare. The symbol did its work softly, ruthlessly, and without permission slips. On campuses, the arguments sharpened into vocabulary. Truth rights became a phrase that moved from seminars to student senates, then into campus policy drafts about medical histories and sealed records. Not everyone agreed, and that was the point. They were fighting over values instead of slogans. If power needs the lie, then the lie belongs to power, one student argued, and the room wrote the sentence down. Another countered, "Privacy is not the same as secrecy," and that stayed on the board too. The debate felt like a nation learning to breathe through its nose after years of gasping. In group chats, kids shared tactics instead of gossip: ask early, document. Gently, forgive slowly, keep receipts. They built spreadsheets for relatives' health data and calendars for family meetings that had always been not the right time. When someone panicked, the answer came back as a chorus. You are not defined by their lie. When someone asked, "Then who am I?" the reply was practical. Start with what's true today. The symbol had calcified into a habit, move toward the fact even when your legs shake. Especially then. Youth-led nonprofits sprang up like roadside shrines turned into cathedrals. They ran hotlines for teens in the blast radius of revelations and trained volunteers to listen more than they suggested. They published a compact that read, "Truth without cruelty, privacy without deceit," and it spread like a sticker on laptops and water bottles. Small-town school boards adopted the compact first because small towns know exactly how much pretending costs. Big city districts followed with laminated posters and new counseling budgets that made spreadsheets cry. The chain reaction had found a rhythm. Journalists learned to write this generation as subjects, not props. They stopped asking kids for dramatic quotes and started asking them for definitions. What does a truthful life look like? One profile led, and the student said, "I want my paperwork to match my heart." What does freedom feel like? Another asked. And the reply was being able to say, what is not what plays. The articles landed softer and heavier at once like a blanket with weight sewn in. The symbol had taught the press a strict lesson. Dignity is not the enemy of detail. Politicians tried to ride the wave and discovered it would not carry passengers. Photo ops with transparency banners drew yawns from the very kids who had invented the word's new meaning. One candidate promised full origin audits, and students replied, "Start with telling the truth about your mistakes." Another boasted, "My family has nothing to hide," and a teenager wrote back, "Then show us what you hid from yourselves." The old performance trick sounded like trying to charm a smoke alarm. The room would not stop ringing because someone smiled. Everywhere the symbol traveled, it lost none of its voltage. It hurt to look at, and people looked anyway. Teachers changed their rubrics to reward sourcing over spectacle. Parents changed their habits to reward candor over comfort. Youth pastors swapped sermons about destiny for talks about integrity, and kids actually stayed to listen. Therapists said disclosures that once detonated families now bent them without breaking them, because the expectation of truth had arrived before the truth did. The young were learning to carry facts like heavy water, awkward, necessary, life-saving. Barron did not dissolve into caricature. He hardened into a lesson no one wanted and everyone used. In the rare moments he surfaced, someone always zoomed in on his hands, steady, unsteady, and the screen lit with that old ache again. If he spoke, it was mostly in refusals. If he smiled, it was thin and unpracticed. He looked like a person trying to walk across a floor that had just been mopped, careful, embarrassed, polite. The generation read his caution as an instruction manual. Move slowly. Hold on to the rail. Own every step you do not fall. High school seniors began to write college essays that started where most essays end. They did not brag, they confessed. "I told my mother I wanted the truth, and she cried, and we made tea," one wrote, and the admissions officer underlined the sentence twice. "I used to treat image like oxygen," another admitted. "Then I learned that oxygen is invisible and still essential." Guidance counselors grinned at the paradox. Teenagers had brought poetry back to applications by refusing to perform. The symbol had turned pressure into prose. In the arts, the red ring evolved from accusation into invitation. Visual artists placed the circle over landscapes and faces, reminding viewers that emptiness can be honest too. Choreographers set duets where one dancer represented image and the other represented proof. The audience cried without entirely knowing why. Songwriters kept the choruses playing, "Tell me what is true. Tell me what is mine. Tell me what is left." The tracks hit charts because the hooks were clean and the world was tired of clever. The generation that could conjure filters by instinct had decided to sing without them. Sports teams wrote new slogans on the inside of their jerseys where cameras could not see. "Earn the tape," a wrestling coach said, pointing at the ankle straps that decide who starts. "Earn the truth," a captain answered, and the room roared because the phrase sounded like a challenge instead of a chore. In locker rooms, victories grew quieter and losses grew braver because the scoreboard could be wrong about the only score that mattered. Coaches reported fewer tantrums, more apologies, and better sleep. The truth had become competitive. Even the internet, addicted to speed, slowed down a fraction. Influencers who built empires on glossy edits posted shaky noise videos about the parts they had cut. Views dipped and then rebounded stronger, stickier, less fragile. Content that admitted error traveled farther than content that insisted on perfection, and the algorithm learned a new appetite. One streamer looked into the lens and said, "I lied last year." Here is the list, and the comments wrote only 2 words of thank you. The like button had never seen humility at scale. By spring graduation, speeches sounded like closing arguments for a better case. Valedictorians stopped telling their classes they were special and told them they were responsible. "We cannot choose our origin," one said, "but we can choose our alignment." Make your documents boring, another joked, and your character unforgettable. Every gymnasium thundered at that line because it released them from the pose and pushed them toward the practice. Caps flew for the first time in years without anyone screaming about the brand on the tassel. Barron's name appeared in fewer headlines and more footnotes, which is where symbols live when they have done their work. He remained controversial to some, pitied by others, and necessary to many who never needed his approval. The country did not absolve him. It used him honestly, which is the closest thing to mercy a public can offer. His most useful act had been involuntary. He showed them what it costs to live inside a photo. And then quietly, he showed them how to live afterward. Teachers ended the year with a slide the students could recite by heart. It held two sentences that fit a classroom, a courtroom, and a kitchen table. Live with the truth, the first line read, and the room answered the way a congregation answers a psalm. Not with a fabricated image, the second line read, and the room did not answer because agreement had already become habit. The bell rang, and nobody left quickly. The new reflex was to stay long enough to verify. In the final reckoning, the generation did not crown a martyr or burn a monster. It accepted a mirror. They learned to choose documents over rumors without hating the people who had taught them to prefer the opposite. They learned that mercy and honesty must be stapled together or both will tear under pressure. They learned that the cleanest sentence in public life is, "I was wrong," and that the bravest follow-up is, "Here is the proof." When they finally looked up from the paperwork, the country looked different and for once durable. The lights fade in the chamber, but the story doesn't die here. If anything, this is where it begins. You've just witnessed how a single envelope, a single chart, a single voice can drag an empire into the light. Dynasties spend decades constructing their walls, their images, their legends, and all of it can be shattered in seconds when truth takes the microphone. That moment is bigger than Barron, bigger than Melania, bigger than the Trump name. This is about us, about whether we choose to hide in shadows or whether we rise and demand the full light of truth. So let me ask you directly, when the truth is laid out in front of you, what do you do? Do you turn away because it's uncomfortable? Do you retreat to silence because it's safer? Or do you take that truth raw and heavy as it is and use it to build something better? That's the question Jasmine forced onto America's table, and it's the same question I'm forcing onto yours right now. Because history isn't written only by leaders, it's written by audiences, by citizens, by ordinary people, deciding whether to act or to look away. And if you're still here, still watching it, means you already know the answer. You feel it in your chest, the thump of adrenaline, the chill in your spine. This wasn't just drama. This wasn't just theater. This was a battle over reality itself, streamed live and seen by millions. And if it shook you, then don't just consume it. Act on it. Hit that subscribe button right now because this is only the beginning. Every week we go further. We pull back more curtains. We shine the light in places they pray will stay dark. You do not want to miss what comes next, and the only way to stay ahead of it is to lock in with us here today. But don't stop at subscribing. Truth doesn't spread by accident. It spreads because people like you carry it. Share this video with your friends, your family, your coworkers. Share it with people who still believe the myth, people who cling to the image instead of the evidence. Because the only way myths survive is in silence, in darkness, in unchallenged corners. Every share you make is like swinging open a door and letting light pour in. Every share breaks the chains that keep these stories trapped in denial. And if you think your voice doesn't matter, think again. The comments you leave aren't just comments. They're proof to the algorithm that people are watching, reacting, fighting back. Drop your thoughts below. Tell us, is family defined by blood, or is it defined by honesty? Say it out loud right now, where the world can see it. Because when thousands of people speak together, it isn't noise, it's a movement. And movements are what change nations. Remember, power always counts on fatigue. They hope you'll be shocked today, distracted tomorrow, and silent by next week. But that cycle ends here. Because the more we talk, the more we share, the more we demand answers, the harder it becomes for lies to breathe. Jasmine proved it in that chamber. You can prove it in this one with a click, with a share, with a single sentence in the comments that refuses to let this moment vanish. And listen, don't think for 1 second this story ends with Barron. No, this is bigger than any single name. This is about setting a new standard, about refusing to let families build power on deception while preaching morality to the rest of us. It's about saying loud and clear that truth is the baseline, not the exception. And if you don't fight for that baseline, no one else will. The people in power will not give it to you. You have to take it. So here's the call, plain and unpolished: subscribe, share, comment, Stay with us as we tear down the walls they hide behind. Stay with us as we follow the paper trails, the contracts, the whispers they thought would never reach daylight. Because when it does reach daylight, and it will, you'll want to be here first, watching, knowing, spreading it further. And don't forget why it matters. Because the map Jasmine held up wasn't just DNA, it was a mirror. A mirror pointed at an entire country. It didn't just reveal one family's deception, it revealed how much we've tolerated, how long we've been willing to accept stories in place of evidence. But now with one chart, with one empty circle glowing red, we've seen it. And once you've seen the truth, you can't unsee it. You can't go back. So let's not go back. Let's go forward. Together. Let's make this story not just the scandal of the year, but the turning point of a generation. Let's make it the line in the sand where Americans decided that no family, no dynasty, no fortune stood above the truth. And let's start right here with you. Hit subscribe, hit share, drop your voice in the comments, be part of this movement, because at the end of the day, history will not remember who sat quietly. It will remember who stood, who spoke, who spread the fire until the whole house had to wake up. And if you've come this far, if you've watched this long, then you already know you're one of those people. So stand with us. Stand with Jasmine. Stand with the truth. The story is not over. The fight is not over. And the next revelation could drop any second. Stay ready. Stay loud. Stay here. Because the truth is coming and no one stands above it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.